So I have everything erased. It's time to start adding the color. And there are some things you need to understand about color, about the media that you're going to use. Some media, because you're going to do so much layering, some media you have to put down first because it will ruin the material to put it on top of something else, or it will be completely ineffective on top of something else. So your permanent markers, you want permanent markers, not regular markers, because if you get anything wet, regular markers would, the pigments would loosen up and get all watery and smear. And on this project, you want the permanent markers to stay, you want the colors that you're putting down with permanent markers to stay clean. So in this one, these areas right here that kind of look like stained glass windows, that's what I did in permanent marker. And I think it works very effectively in this composition. So permanent marker would go down first. Permanent markers and colors would go down first. Then if there's anything that you want in color that maybe you don't want the colors to be quite so vivid, if you wanted to do any oil crayon. So on this one, actually the only things that I did in terms of undercoloring is sort of this fuzzy darkness around my stones. I guess I was thinking kind of like a grout effect around the stones, and so the oil crayons worked for that. But do not, once you've started with oil crayons, do not go back to permanent marker, because it will ruin the tips of your marker if they get on top of oil crayon. So really, you have to make your decision. Anything you want in permanent marker, do it first, then put the permanent markers away. Then the next layer would be anything with watercolor. Watercolor is transparent and you need water. So it would go, it would not smear any of the permanent marker that you do. But anything you do in watercolor, an opaque material, so transparent you can see through, opaque you cannot see through. Anything you do in watercolor is going to be transparent. The opaque materials would cover them up. In this composition, the only thing I did with watercolors is actually just a black wash that went over most of the painting. I got a little bit on my permanent markers just to make it look like a shadow edge. It would have gone right over those permanent markers and dulled it more than I wanted it to. But if once you get your permanent markers on, you wanted them to be dulled, you could dull them, make the color just a little softer, a little bit more neutralized by putting watercolor washes on top of it. When that was dry, I moved to the tempera paint. And tempera paint is where a lot of this was done. This purple area, the orange, these flower power, the yellow. This is actually the second layer because it was pink the first time. These greens, all of these stones, this pink into the orange and the yellow. When that was completely dry, then I went on top of that with colored pencil, and I used this really nice white white pastel. Is that what it's called? It's a white charcoal. And so to get my whites just as bright and pristine, I used a combination of that white chalk and the white tempera paint. Now, something I learned on this one, so on this blue and white highway, which has actually been painted a couple of times, I did some oil crayon on it because I was thinking, well, let me scuff like every other section up. I'm gonna scuff it up. I didn't like it, so then I went back and I painted tempera on top. So this one right here, I have been unable to get the tempera paint to stick on top of the oil crayon in that one area. So anywhere that you put oil crayon, it will resist any of the paints that you put on top of it. So you just need to be mindful of that, which works great. Say I'm putting it as a grout around these stones, then the paint doesn't stick to the grout area, but on here it didn't work. I'm having a hard time covering that up and getting that nice and white. I still haven't figured out how I'm gonna resolve that yet. I'll figure something out though. So So I've laid out my materials kind of in the order that I would use them, and I'm going to go to my picture and figure out, is there anything that I want done in permanent marker? One thing I want to do when I'm choosing the colors is I'm going to work with a lot of analogous color combinations. And so in any area, I want to try to use, well, I just want to work analogously. So you think of the color wheel, like for the yellows, I want to go any of the different yellows and then go into greens or oranges, like they would be positioned on a color wheel. If I was working with orange, likewise, all of the different oranges, and then I would, beside it, I may work with the reds or I would work with the yellows. And that's just how, those are the color choices I'm going to make as I go around. Instead of working with highly contrasting colors, when they're grouped together, say this area, again, I'll work with analogous combinations. So I finished everything that I wanted to do in permanent marker, and it's kind of this place where I just have to make a decision like, okay, I'm done with marker and I'm going to start using the oil crayon. And just so I'm not tempted to use my permanent markers, I'm putting them away and I'm going to pull out oil crayon. And I like how it worked on here. I kind of like, it's sort of this, I don't know, it roughens it up a little bit, I guess, by doing that sort of grout effect around my stones. So I'm going to do that again for this one. And so all I need is a black oil crayon, and I'm going to go just around the stone. So there aren't a lot of places, but that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to start, since this smears so easily, I'm right-handed, I'm going to start and then move in this, start on the left side, move in this direction. So in my picture, with this one I did the black and white checkerboard, and I decided to not do a checkerboard on this one. So my next step is going to be watercolor. So for now I'm done with the oil crayon. I could come back and do oil crayon on top of the whole thing if I wanted, like kind of on top of the tempera paint when it's dry. But now it's time for me to consider the watercolor, and I really did like the watercolor here behind the flower power. So it just very quickly and simply gave a gray background for that, which worked well for me. I mean, you could go with a color of watercolor. You could go with a color of watercolor in any part of your composition. So since I'm just gonna do kind of a wash, let me get, I think what I'm gonna do is just on the edge, maybe on these, so it makes it look like things are in front of it. So you might be able to see right here. I could always do it with colored pencil though. And since I'm planning on doing tempera paint, I don't have to worry about, I'm going to be able to layer colors on top of this watercolor wash. But I'm going to go to the watercolor and let me just go ahead and start painting. So when you use the watercolor on good watercolor paint, you have the freedom to do something like fill an area with a wash. The paper can withstand all this water on your paper. I definitely want to get watercolor over top of this oil crayon. I'm kind of resisting putting it on top of my footpath and my bridges, but I don't know if that's necessary. When I put that watercolor on that black, you can see just how dark that is. And I know I'm going to paint the flowers in, so that's not, I just have to think the gray that I want behind my flowers, do I want it to be that dark? And I'm at peace with that. And same over here, I'll be painting over. Still resisting painting on top of the bridges. I don't know for sure why. So this is a fun time. You can see the different effect. Like that's how it looks, the watercolor, when I'm putting it on top of wet paper, because I painted it with water, and then this is how it looks when I just go with pigment on top of the dry paper. Definitely want to get this painted in here. Typically when you work with watercolor, you have to plan for your white areas. But for this composition, since we know we're going to be layering tempera on top, I don't have to plan so carefully for the white areas. And I think I'm going to make this simple on myself and just go ahead and just paint over the whole thing. Except, well, I guess I could show you, if I paint on top of the permanent marker, it's just going to dull the colors, particularly if I paint it over it with this black. It won't smear it, but it'll make it more dull. But right now I'm liking sort of the jewel-like quality, so I don't know if I want to paint over them or not. There. All right, I did it. I got the paint, so you can see how it's just almost aging it. That idea, like it's not as fancy and bright. Just dulling it down a little bit. Might regret that. We'll see. And I'm at peace that some places it's a darker gray and some places it's a lighter gray. But one thing I am doing is keeping those white dots as much as possible. The white dots inside these little scallop shapes that I did. Too dark. Those colors just got really dull. If I change my mind, I need to change my mind now, or I'll have to paint over it. If it's too dull, then I'll have to paint over it. paint over it. So my painting is dry where I did the watercolor wash, and I chose to just do the black wash, and my hope is to add some anywhere where the tempera paint doesn't go, to have a little bit of depth there, a little bit of shadow instead of just the stark whites. I did leave these little tiny spots inside, these little rainbow sort of things. I left those white, and like right now I'm thinking maybe I'll do some metallic paint inside those as a final step, but we'll see how it goes. I might leave it white, might take white paint and paint those, we'll see. So a lot of it, for me at least, unfolds as I go along. Now for you as an artist, you might have very, very specific visions for all of your areas, and that is awesome. If you're able to plan that well, that is fantastic. I think that's an artistic gift that you have. So roll with that if you've got it. I did decide to do the wash on top of the watercolor, and one of the reasons is that in this finished example, one thing that kind of bothers me is how bright some of these colors are, and I think I used a fluorescent permanent marker right there, but these areas just are so bright, and so I'm sort of adjusting for that now in this picture by getting that watercolor wash on it, so it sort of dulls the colors a little bit. So I have now it's time for me to do tempera paint. It's totally dry. Having it taped down, I can feel like a little bit of waviness to my paper, but it is taped down, so it should dry pretty flat. It is drying pretty flat. I'm going to use, I have a variety of brushes here. I've got my water and a towel. And I'm going to continue with the idea of analogous colors as I paint with the tempera paint. I'm also going to work with different values of color. And value is the lightness and darkness of a color. So I'm just going to pick an area and start painting and kind of talk through how I'm using the tempera paint, and then I'm going to continue throughout my picture painting. I think I'm going to do this checkerboard because it will be an easy area to kind of talk and paint at the same time. I really love this pink, so I'm going to start with the pink. My tempera paint is pretty thick, so sometimes the really thick paint, you could dip your brush in a little bit of water and then just kind of mash that water into the tempera paint, and it will make it a little bit thinner. And I will start with pure pink right out of my ice cube tray here. I'm trying to stay within the lines, but if it gets a little bit on the black line, it might look okay that way, or I can always go back and with a colored pencil, when this is totally dry, I can do those black lines again. So working with value. On my tray, I'm going to get some white. And I'm just going to set that brush there so I could use it later. And a little bit of black. A little bit of black goes a long way, so I'm not going to need a lot of black. Now, to make a color lighter, you know already to add white. And the more white you add, the lighter it's going to get. So there, and that is called a tint. So right there I have a tint of pink that I'm going to paint with. So I can go in either direction. I could add more pink to that, so it's less light. It's one direction I could go. And it's kind of an efficient use of time and paint to, if I already have it mixed up, just continue working with that color. Or I could add more white to it. So remember, I added some pink, so this may not be much lighter than what I had before, so I'm gonna add a lot more white. Get it really light. I don't like that there. I'm gonna go over here with this one. I like it. I didn't like how it looked between these two more pink areas, so instead I'm gonna put it over here. So that's one way of doing it, mixing it in the palette. You can also mix right on the painting. You just may not have as much control of the precise color you're gonna get. So I'm gonna kind of get the paint off the brush and dip right into the pink and paint on top of that white. And so I'll get another shade, or tint rather, not shade, another value. So the other direction we can go with values, and I'm going to continue painting with the pink, but the other direction I can go with the values is with the shades. So let me get some more pink on my tray. So with the value, you're making the color darker, so you add a little bit of black. The black is super, super strong, so just a tiny amount of black will change the color. May have gone just a little too wimpy on that. I'm gonna give just a little bit more. Now I'm gonna add a little more black to that. Whoa, got really dark. So those are shades of the pink. Now the other thing I can do is make a tone of pink. And a tone of pink is when you mix, a tone of a color is when you mix gray into a color. And to make gray, you mix black and white. So let me make a little gray over here. My brush has pink on it. But there's essentially a little bit of gray, and now I'm gonna add the pink to that. And that is a tone. And it is simply another value in the lights and darks of a color. The other thing I can do, so all I've done is work with pink and black and white. I could also start working with analogous colors. So if I wanted to start mixing like purple into that pink, and maybe, or I could go red into that pink, and I think I'm gonna work, I think I may do just a little bit of red. So those are the things I'm gonna be doing just as I go forward. Okay, so I finished this checkerboard area. So I was doing the tints, tones, and shades of the pink, and then I added some reds and oranges in this area, and then I added some of the purples into this area. And here's what my palette looks like. The bridges and those first things that I drew, I'm saving those for last because those are the things that are closest to the viewer. They're the highest layer in the painting. So if I get little bits of paint on them, when I finish those off, I'll be able to cover up any of those little bits. And you can see here on the edge on my tape, I can just paint onto the tape, and then when it's all dry, it'll have that clean, crisp edge. So I'm gonna do the flower power area just to kind of talk you through that a little bit. So for each flower, I kind of think of the flower as a study or as exploration within a color family, sort of analogous colors. So here I did yellows, here I did greens and blues, but what happens is this green flower is a part of this flower, so we have the green and the orange and the red and the blue together. So have fun with how you work through the spectrum and how you put colors beside each other. Remember, analogous colors are close to each other on the color wheel, and they always look great mixed together. Colors that are far from each other on the color wheel are called complementary colors. They're very different from one another, but they make each other look good. They make the other look brighter when they're positioned beside each other. So you can consider that element when you're making choices of what colors the petals will be. So I'm gonna start with yellow, and really it's very, very similar to the first process, and I get some yellow on my tray and then I paint it. I just paint this one in yellow, and then I'm going to dip into the white, which all my white is dirty, so I need to get some fresh white on my tray. I dip into the white, and now I make a tint of yellow. For me personally, I'm not a big fan of tones and shades of yellow just because it ends up looking greenish, but it is a valid thing that you could mix together. But instead I'm going to go with this fluorescent yellow and mix that in there. And I'm doing my mixing in the tray or on my painting so that I keep my ice cube tray, the colors in there, as clean as possible. Mix white into that. So there's my first yellow flower. So looking at these here, my color choices will be on, well, what colors do I want to work with this yellow? And I think I'm going to go into the greens and maybe into blue, since we're going to have this separating it. But so that's how I'll think through. Maybe over here I'll go into oranges, for example. So those are just some of the things I'll think through as I pick colors. And I'm also looking at this one and thinking of colors, like I really like these colors, so I might emphasize those colors in here. But just every artwork is going to be different. The fact that I have this big field of these colors, maybe these here won't be the best choices. So I'll just kind of have to see how it unfolds as I start painting things in. So I decided the next thing I want to work on, I finished the flower power. Oh, I gotta paint something right there. So I gotta fill that in, but I'm gonna do this, and I think I'm gonna do sort of a color wheel thing, but using these colors. So I'll get these colors over onto this part of my picture. So let me paint this little spot here. And I'll put some white in that. So it's a little bit different from the spot beside it. And I'm gonna just start working with these colors in general. I like starting with a pure color, and then just sort of makes it easy, an easy place to start, and then I can start just adding little dabs of color to it on my paint palette, and it can go pretty quickly that way. Particularly if I've found some colors that I like working with, which I have with this green and then the two blues and white. Okay, so last night I did quite a bit of painting, and so I just want to point out some things. I decided on this one for all of my circles or my stones that are grouted together. I kind of wanted to go with the turquoisey colors, and so then that led me to choosing orange for these strips that go through there and even this line, because they kind of complement one another. And then I went ahead and painted this, the clean white of the Tempera paint. And I thought I was going to keep the gray space behind the flower power and this ring. I was considering leaving them both gray, but I've decided today I want to try painting them a nice light blue, kind of a sky blue. So I'm going to need to mix that up. And something else I'm at least considering, I don't know if I want to keep this as star, so I could always paint over that. It was done originally in permanent marker, but I may paint over it with tempera paint and do more of like a pinwheel like that's there. I don't know, I haven't decided yet. It's the only place really where I have like the fractured triangles. So I don't know, I may leave it just for sort of a surprise in the picture, or I may paint it in a way that connects it with another area of the picture. I'm still trying to decide. But for now, I'm gonna go ahead and paint in this gray, and we'll see how it goes. Okay, it's time for the final stages with my picture. And on top of all of the different media that I've used, I do not use marker. You can ruin the tips of your marker by putting it on top of especially the oil crayons, but some of the other media also. So do not use markers at all, either permanent markers or regular markers. But what you can use are chalk pastels, and these are just an assorted blend. I have this beautiful set of fluorescent colors, and so I was kind of thinking mine ended up so colorful I could use some chalks maybe to accent some colors. You can use oil crayons, and I found that it's a little bit, it varies from color to color how well it shows up on top of the tempera paint or on top of the different media. And once you use oil crayon, then the other media do not go on top of it. It will resist. If you put oil crayon on an area, then it will resist the chalks, the colored pencils, and even if you try to paint tempera paint on top of this. And you could still go into areas painting with tempera paint. And then there are colored pencils, and this is great for fine line details. I'm gonna go in and get some of my black lines defined again. I may do some shading using the black or some of the dark colored pencils, or maybe some shading using the darker chalks. And another thing I can do is go in to colors and just kind of work with the colored pencils, maybe with a related color, to get some different tones of that color in a particular area, or just add some variety, which can add some richness to it. But right now I'm kind of liking the mostly flat sort of effect of the tempera paint, and I love that about tempera paint, that when you paint it, it is a flat, chalky finish, almost like chalk paint on furniture. It just is that flat finish, and I'm really liking it with this one. With this picture, I worked a lot with kind of the colored pencils, getting some varieties in the colors, and I like the richness, that rich effect on this one. But for this one, I'm preferring that flat effect. For your picture, I want you to decide which effect you want. So I'm going to work with these materials for a little bit, and we'll see what we get. Okay, I went through and pretty much the only thing I did was with the black colored pencil go back and do the black outlines. I did use a white charcoal pencil and did those little dots that I had mentioned earlier, and I took a white colored pencil and went over these colors a little bit to lighten them up a little bit. But for my composition, I think for now I'm satisfied with the balance of like little small details and bigger spaces. I like the balance of having this big, wide white space. So I think I'm finished and I'm ready to untape mine. But I wanted to refer to the original works of art that we looked at, a couple of them that we looked at from the artist on Instagram, and just show you things that she did, like small white lines or black lines, repeated lines that give rhythm to some of her shapes, and then even breaking up these highways that we talked about at the beginning, breaking them up into shapes and painting different colors, even dividing them, adding lots of colors along one of the little highways. So those are things that maybe are going to work for your composition. I want you to look at your picture and make that decision. So now I'm going to pull the tape off and we'll see what we got. It's almost worth taping your picture down just so you get, now I stopped because it's starting to rip up the paper. So it tells me I need to be a little more careful as I pull this off. I'll go in that direction. Hopefully I'll be able to fix whatever was ripping over there. Let's see. What I was gonna say is it's almost worth just this revealing process to go to the trouble of taping it, because this is just fun. The paper ripped up right there. So I'll just glue that down, and I think that's gonna be okay. But ta-da! There is my finished, I think I started calling it the works, but I think I'm gonna call it an aerial map of the city of Colorville. So maybe the works is a better name because it's shorter. But I hope you guys have fun with this. You can always shake it up. Maybe you want to stop like where we did the black lines, and instead of going in with color, you could develop just use black markers and develop a Zentangle design. Or you could work much larger and primarily work with paint. I think the concept of how you divide the papers up and then you're divide your paper up with the highways and then these sort of shapes. Remember, it was like a pond with a path around it, and then filling in the land masses of your city with different patterns. I think you could, if you start with that concept, you could use lots of different media to make a beautiful work of art. So have fun. I would love to see what you do with it, and I'll talk to y'all soon.